Welcome back to another lesson on ancient China. If you recall from our last unit, we learned about the Xia, Shang, and Zhou dynasty. If you remember, there aren't much information about the Xia dynasty, and we thought it to be possibly a mythical dynasty. Then we have the Shang dynasty, which by some historians consider this to be the first dynasty of China. We then learned about the developments and achievements of the Zhou dynasty, but we began to see the peaceful and stable times changing as the Zhou rule gradually weakened. And in 771 BC, nomads from the north and west sacked the Zhou capital and murdered the Zhou monarch. Although some of the Zhou royal family members were able to escape the attack and re-establish their capital at Luoyang, the Zhou kings were pretty much powerless at this point. Lords in different territories claimed to be kings in their own territory and often fought with each other for power. And so this period of the Zhou was called the Warring States period. We will finally see around the 3rd century BC where this new dynasty, the Qin dynasty, taking over and replacing the chaotic Zhou dynasty. We will begin to see the end of the Warring States period and the unification of the country. So here, let's start with our lesson on the Qin dynasty, and we'll also be talking about the Han dynasty later in our presentation as well. So let's get started. So as we mentioned in our previous slide, we have powerful states that fought one another and ignored the authority of the Zhou kings. And one of the states, the western state of Qin, gradually defeated its chief rivals and eventually established itself as a new dynasty, replacing the Zhou dynasty. So we really credit all of this to a person named Qin Shi Huangdi, who in 241 BC began to rule by crushing internal battles and defeating invaders. He expanded the empire as far south as modern-day Vietnam. He founded the Qin dynasty employing legalist ideas to subdue the warring states and unified his country. In fact, to prevent any oppositions to his government, he and his prime minister, the legalist philosopher Li Su, actually murdered hundreds of Confucian scholars and burned books of Confucian poets and thinkers who disagreed with the legalist. Through the extent of actions such as these, Shi Huangdi established an autocracy, which is a government that had unlimited power, which the power is pretty much all centralized, given to the central government, allowing the government to use their power in arbitrary manners. With his government, he also provided a number of programs to promote centralization, and these programs included the building of highway networks of more than 4,000 miles and setting the same standards across different aspects of China, such as standard laws, currency, weight and measures. And under his reign, although many considered him to be an ambitious and harsh leader, he was also known for some of the developments in Chinese society, allowing for canals to be built, expanding trade with new road systems. But to fund all of these, harsh taxes and a repressive government made many people resentful under the Qin rule. So as mentioned in our previous slide there, legalism was adopted as the official ideology of this regime. Punishment for those who opposed legalist ideals were severe, even resulting in execution. Shi Huangdi is known for acting decisively to crush political opposition within his government. To destroy the power of any of the rival warlords, he introduced this policy called strengthening the trunk and weakening the branches. This policy was enacted to have all noble families live in the capital city under his suspicious gaze, and with this policy, about 120,000 noble families were removed from their lands, and all of their lands would be seized by the government. Shi Huangdi would then have control over all of the land and divided China into 36 administrative districts, and we would appoint certain Qin officials to control them. Again, anyone opposing the ideas of legalism, especially Confucian scholars and thinkers, were punished and executed, as well as writings and books that contained Confucius ideas were also burned and destroyed. So considered as one of the most well-known sites in the world, the longest wall in the world, called the Great Wall of China, was actually strengthened by Shi Huangdi during the Qin dynasty. If you recall, there had been some part of the wall that was already built by the earlier Zhou dynasty to defend themselves from invaders and attacks from the north. But the big project of strengthening and extending the wall took place in the Qin and later dynasties. Shi Huangdi decided to embark on this project of closing the gaps and extending it almost the length of the empire's border. This made it much harder for enemies to actually invade China, as they would have to gallop halfway to Tibet to get around it. The wall extended from the Yellow Sea to the Gobi Desert in the west, and the wall twisted like a dragon's tail for thousands of miles. Hundreds of thousands of peasants were forced into labor, collecting, hauling, and dumping millions of tons of stone, dirt, and rubble to fill the core of the Great Wall. Peasants weren't given a choice. They didn't work for wages, nor did they volunteer for the love of the empire, but rather they were only given two choices: work on the wall or die. Many of the laborers worked on the wall and died during construction, working through the tedious labor work in harsh winter weathers. The forced labor policy and high taxes necessary for the wall's construction made the Qin rule very unpopular. So here on this map, you can actually compare the extent of the Zhou dynasty, drawn with a red line, with the Qin dynasty colored in red there. You can see that the Qin dynasty expanded further northwest and to the south. You could also see the extent of the construction of the Great Wall of China. So as you may remember, classical China centered on the Huanghe or Yellow River there on the map, and is pretty much geographically isolated, but they were still threatened by invaders that would enter China from the north. And so the Great Wall was built for China's protection from the northern invaders. And here's an image of the Great Wall of China, and these walls were built with slabs of cut stone on the outside and enclosed with a heap of pebbles and rubble on the inside. Each section of the wall rose to a height of 20 to 25 feet. Again, here's another image of the Great Wall of China, and you would see the towers rising every 200 to 300 yards along the wall. So these watchtowers were built with different distances actually between each other, not in the same exact distances, but they do serve an important aspect. These watchtowers were especially valued and extensively used during the Han Dynasty. So what do you think they were used for? I'll give you all a moment to give it a guess in the chat. So one of the most important functions of the watchtowers was that it was very important for transmitting signals before a battle. These watchtowers would allow the Chinese to watch their enemies' movements and transmit signals. So when the soldiers on the tower saw the approach of their enemies, they would puff smoke into daytime or light up a fire at night to send messages from one station to another, so that their entire army would be prepared and aware of the enemy's approach. These signals could also provide a message to the emperor in the capital city as well. Another function of the towers was its use as a storage place. Each tower actually rose up to 3 stories high, and the first and second floors were used as living quarters for the soldiers and storage rooms for grain and supplies. And as you can see, the walls and towers were built with great detailed consideration in mind. Here's a picture drawn to show you the massive labor that was required to be put into the constructing of this wall. This was intensive labor, as materials needed to be gathered, carried, and organized for this construction. All of the work that was put into this massive project resulted in thousands of deaths and poor conditions in which farmers and peasants were crushed by heavy taxes. As you could possibly imagine, people were dissatisfied with the Qin rule. So Shi Huangdi was actually quite convinced that immortality existed, as he was able to survive through 3 assassination attempts. And after those attempts, he became even more obsessed with death and sought out magical and medicinal potions for immortality. He would hire magicians to create a potion for immortality and ordered a national hunt for the 8 immortals he believed existed. To maintain his safety, he began to stop going into public and began to move through underground tunnels for protection. And finally, he had thousands of terracotta or hardened clay soldiers and horses built to be buried with him to protect him after his death. Failing to find a workable potion of immortality, he was determined to provide himself with a comfortable and secured afterlife condition as the one he's currently having. And he sought to build something that would resemble his living palace and had artisans create an army of over 8,000 terracotta warriors, fully armed to protect him on the other side or afterlife. The tomb was super extravagant, and it was thought to be a vision of heaven. So how did we know all of this? Well, in March of 1974, considered to be one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of modern times, thanks to a group of peasants who initially founded this massive tomb when attempting to dig up a well in the Shaanxi province in northwest China, which was about half an hour drive from the ancient Qin capital of Shangjiang. This arguably extraordinary underground treasure were discovered with life-size terracotta soldiers and horses that were dated of more than 2,000 years ago. So here's an image of the terracotta soldiers that were found in the underground pit. As you can see, each soldier had their own distinctive form. It really was intended to be a recreation of Qin Shi Huangdi's imperial guard, which was meant to protect the emperor on his journey to the next world. In fact, the original creation of these figures even included brilliantly painted colors, but the original excavations led to the inability to preserve the original colors of the uniforms. Nevertheless, you can see that this was definitely another massive and expensive construction project of the Qin dynasty. And in fact, 1/3 of the national income was spent on the afterlife of the emperor, and again drastically exhausting another part of the nation's treasury. And here's just another image of the terracotta figures of Qin Shi Huangdi's underground tomb. Here's a closer look at the figures, and as you can see, the carvings show very detailed attention to human proportion, anatomy, and facial features. So the Qin dynasty only lasted a short time. You may be wondering, how did Shi Huangdi die? Well, his death is quite a mystery, as there are not extensive record for us to actually know how he died. But according to some sources, he may have died because of poisoning after drinking what he thought to be the magical potion for immortality. And then after Shi Huangdi's death, his son took power, and although followed the same cruel policies as his father, the son proved to be less able. The dynasty saw peasant rebellions and uprisings just 3 years after the second Qin emperor took office, which really threatened the security of the empire. And by 202 BC, the harsh rule of the Qin came to an end and was replaced by the Han dynasty. So let's learn about the Han dynasty in our second half of this presentation. Alright, so like we said, with the fall of the Qin, we see the rise of the Han dynasty, which lasted much longer than the Qin did. The Han lasted from 202 BC to 220 CE, a little over 400 years. So as we mentioned before, the end of the Qin dynasty was faced with peasant rebellions, and one of the leaders, Lü Bang, a peasant from the land of Han, marched his troops into the capital city, overthrowing the cruel Qin dynasty. Lü Bang declared himself the first emperor of the Han dynasty and established central authority by setting up local leaders called commanderies who reported to him. To win the support of these local leaders, Lü Bang decided to depart from Shi Huangdi's strict legalism and abandoned the use of cruel and unusual punishments that had been part of legalism. Instead, he began to establish Confucian principles as the basis of the new state's philosophy. And with this philosophy applied to his government, he sought to lower taxes and soften harsh punishments, which made him popular with the people of China, bringing peace and stability to China. And when Lü Bang died in 195 BC, he was succeeded by his son, but in actuality, his son only ruled in name. The real ruler was his mother, Empress Lu, who was one of Lü Bang's wife. It wasn't until Lü Bang's great-grandson, Wu Di, that took the throne in 141 BC that we began to see another important ruler of the Han dynasty. Wu Di held the throne longer than any other Han emperor, and he was known as the Martial Emperor because he adopted a policy of expanding the Chinese empire through war. He was able to expand the empire to the west and northeast into Manchuria and Korea. And under Wu Di, the boundaries of the Han China expanded nearly to the boundaries of present-day China. So here you can see the map of the Han Dynasty. They're colored in red. Modern day China expands more to the west, but you can definitely see the start of expansion here, taking it to quite some extent here with the Han Dynasty. So let's talk about the social structure during the Han Dynasty. So like the other earlier emperors of China, the Han Emperor was believed to be ruled by divine authority. That idea again of serving under a mandate of heaven only as long as their rule was just. The Han society was highly structured, with the Han government relying on a large complex bureaucracy consisting of departments to help them rule. Running the bureaucracy and maintaining an imperial army were expensive, and so to raise money, the government again had to levy taxes. Similar to farmers in ancient India, Chinese peasants would have to give a portion of their crops to the government and also provide a 1 month of service each year, and merchants would just pay taxes. The 1 month service yearly would consist of labor projects such as road constructions, canals, irrigation ditch constructions, or the service could also come in the form of military service. With these types of services, the Han was able to continue the expansion of the Great Wall and also fill the ranks of China's vast armies. As you may recall from our previous lesson on Chinese philosophies, Confucius emphasized on the need for education and to fill the government bureaucracy with knowledgeable and qualified government officials. As we see the Han reversing legalist ideas and enacting Confucianism as their basis for the system of government, we see Wudi's government employing more than 130,000 people and the bureaucracy consisting of 18 different ranks of civil service jobs, which were government jobs that civilians obtained by taking examinations. And through these civil service examinations, the Han was able to recruit the most talented people through a 2-day test that involved testing the applicant's knowledge of Confucianism, history, and law. Those who scored the highest on these examinations would be able to obtain the high-level government positions. The system was highly based on meritocracy, in which government positions were given based on the knowledge and ability of selected people. Although we see these government jobs opening up to civilians in the attempt to allow for people of all classes to have a chance to work for the Chinese government, it still favored the rich because the poor couldn't really afford school and get an education at this time, giving the sons of wealthy landowners a higher chance at government career. And a Mandarin, not to be confused with the Mandarin language of China, but rather a Mandarin is a respected scholar working in the Chinese government. The Mandarin served as a public official in the imperial China of any of the 9 grades or classes that were filled by individuals from the ranks of lesser office holders who passed examinations in Chinese literary classics. So here's to just show you the clearly defined social structure under the Han Dynasty. We see the emperor being at the very top, who again was considered to be somewhat semi-divine. And then we have the kings and governors who were appointed by the emperor. They would govern with the help of state officials, nobles, and scholars. And then you see the peasant farmers taking the middle section of the triangular structure there, as they were considered a vital component of the empire because they were responsible for the food production of society. Artisans and merchants were below them, and near the bottom were soldiers who were responsible in guarding the empire's frontiers. At the bottom of the structure were enslaved persons who were usually conquered peoples. So here again, just a repetition of the previous slide in text for you to see the quick view of the strict social system of the Han. Again, the emperor was believed to be a link between the heaven and earth, and the kings and governors were appointed by the emperor. And then we have state officials, nobles, and scholars who would support the kings and governors. Peasants were again considered vital to society in the aspect of food production. And then below them were artisans and merchants, followed by soldiers who guarded the empire and enslaved peoples who were usually conquered by the Han. During the Han Dynasty, we also see a great number of technological improvements, such as paper, colored harnesses, the plow, wheelbarrow, improved iron tools, and they also begin to employ water to grind grain. We have paper being invented around 105 CE, and paper allowed for books to be printed at a much cheaper price and is more readily available as compared to writing on silk. The invention of paper had an impact on different aspects of Chinese society, from the spread of education to better records of government documents, allowing for Chinese bureaucracy to expand. The collar harnesses for horses allowed horses to pull much heavier loads, as well as the more advanced two-bladed plows allowed for more efficiency as well in farming. Those listed there on the slides are only to name a few of the inventions and developments of the Han Dynasty, but there was more to it. Let's also talk about the commerce under the Han Dynasty. Although agriculture was considered the most important profession in China, commerce still thrived under Han rule. Government monopolies produced silk, which was traded to most of Asia and through India as far west as Europe through the Silk Road. In terms of culture, we see that the Han was working to encourage assimilation, which was the process of making conquered peoples part of the Chinese culture. In order to unify the vast population and to promote assimilation, Chinese farmers were sent to settle in newly colonized areas and encourage intermarriage with local peoples. Local people were also trained with Confucian philosophies and then were also given government posts. We also see the efforts of scholars hoping to unify Chinese culture by recording China's history, dating back before the Qin Dynasty. So we have here the two important productions of China, silk and paper. Sericulture is the production of silk and the rearing of silkworms for the production of silk. And so what is silk? Silk is the byproduct of a caterpillar, and the silkworms would be kept and fed. And in fact, the fun fact is when with them eating day and night, their weight could actually get multiplied 10,000 times a month. Their cocoons, like the one you see there on the slide, would look like the puffy white balls there. And then after that, they would be kept in a warm and dry place for about 8 or 9 days before being boiled. They could also be steamed or baked before dipping them into hot water to remove the gum from the fiber. Starting from the natural protein fiber and getting it to the final product of a silk cloth is a lengthy and complex process. Many people love the fabric of silk, which is known for its softness, warmness, and durability, leading to a high demand of silk. Because it was so profitable, the process of silk production was kept a state secret for thousands of years. And if the secret was known to be revealed by anyone, that person would receive punishment of death. And then there was also paper that was invented, and the quality of paper was strengthened due to the mixture of mulberry bark, rags, and hemp. As mentioned in the previous slide, before the invention of paper, books were created with writings on silk. But paper was cheaper and allowed for people to obtain it in more quantity, as well as a more convenient and efficiency, contributing to the increase in education and other record-keeping purposes. Due to the production and export of silk, we have the Silk Road getting its famous name, and it served as an ancient long trade route that began during this time of the Han Dynasty, which was around 130 BC. The road actually extended from western China to the Mediterranean Sea, stretching across Asia to Europe, really bringing this ancient world of commerce into a massive connection of the East and West. It spanned 4,000 miles across the continents of this Eastern Hemisphere. The Silk Road facilitated trade and contact between China and other cultures as far away as Rome. That's a really long stretch, and not all merchants were able to travel on this route from one end to the other, but they actually were able to travel on parts of this route to get from one place to another. This was not a single route either, but rather it was a series of road, a network of trade routes that made up that route, with many stops along the way. Due to the prosperous trade and commerce, this time period was known as Pax Sinica, which meant Chinese peace, clearly defined by 400 years of peace and prosperity brought under the Han Dynasty. A Silk Road wasn't all about silk either, but they also traded other products as well, including spices, tea, porcelain, and etc. In fact, porcelain, a type of ceramic product that was really appreciated for its intricate artwork and delicacy. The price of porcelain was not cheap, but many people found themselves with appreciation of this white, translucent porcelain ceramic from China. The trading of spices was also significant because spices were not only used to enhance the flavor of food, but it was also used for many other purposes like burning incense in religious ceremonies, It was believed to purify the air and carry prayers. Some spices would also carry a pleasant smell that could hide many of the common household smells. Certain spices were also used for medicinal uses to cure illnesses. They were also added to healing ointments and used as antidotes in certain cases. Spices traded definitely had an impact on other societies and transformed some of the way people lived and eat. The transportation of these products were also much more efficient and helpful with the use of camel caravans through the long route and desert routes. The Romans would obtain these products and would pay in gold. All of this resulted in cultural diffusion, as not only products were traded, but ideas, knowledge, and culture were shared among the different areas. And here we see camels. Camels allowed for the transportation of loads of goods up to 550 pounds while crossing through deserts and long distances between China and Europe. Camels were useful for the transportation because they could actually go for more than 1 week without water, which was very suitable for any dry climate of the desert. The camels were definitely a significant contribution to the expansion and increase of trade by land as the transportation of goods became more efficient and quicker. As you can see there on the map, the outline of the Silk Road in red running across the deserts there from China to Europe. Therefore, again, camel caravans used as a mode of transportation by land provided for efficiency and convenient purposes while traveling through the deserts and this long distance. So as we talked about the dynastic cycle from our last unit, the dynasties would run prosperous or achieve stability for a while and then eventually face a number of problems, leading them to lose the mandate of heaven and decline, leading to a new dynasty. And so same experience with the Han Dynasty. After a period of prosperity, we began to see signs of decline for the Han Dynasty. Although we saw economic and cultural advances, the Han emperors faced some grave problems and one of them were the economic imbalance, where the rich were gaining wealth at the expense of the poor. Large landowners were exempt from paying taxes, allowing them to increase their land holdings, leaving less land for the government to tax. Therefore, the burden of the taxation fell on the small farmers, where the government would actually press harder to collect money. And as a result, there was this big gap between the rich and the poor. During this time of economic problems, political instability also grew. As inexperienced emperors ruled over the Han, the dynasty was seen with chaos, peasant revolts, and unrest that spread throughout China. And during this time, we see Wang Mang, a Confucian scholar and a member of the court, decided that a strong ruler was needed to restore order. And so he led the peasants against the Han rule and took the imperial title for himself, overthrowing the Han, which ended the first half of the Han Dynasty. Despite new reforms enacted by Wang Mang in attempts to restore order like minting new money, redistributing lands to farmers, he was also subject to opposition from the wealthy landowners in which their lands were taken away from them. And also natural disaster such as flooding further contributed to the economic problems once again. Rebels assassinated Wang Mang in 23 CE, and within 2 years, we see a member of the old Han imperial family seizing back the throne and began the second period of the Han Dynasty. Despite efforts to secure borders and keep trade active, the Han weakened over the next century, and by 220 CE, it had divided into 3 rival kingdoms, and we shall continue with what happened after the Han in our later units this year. But for now, that comes to the conclusion of the Qin and the Han Dynasty. Make sure you are studying and getting ready for your unit assessment coming up soon.